Los Angeles is diverse with Armenians from everywhere, including Syria, Iran, the Middle East. And I have to say that during this past month, during this process, I have crossed paths with Armenians from Syria, from Europe, from Greece, from Cyprus, who are as much part of this process, of this transition, as are the residents of Armenia.
Ես նշում եմ ընդգծելու համար տեղի ունեցող process-ի համահայկական որովհետև այս գործընթացի ժամանակ եւ Երևան ու եւ Երևանից դուրս տեսել ենք եւ զգացել ենք ցուցությունը
I am mentioning this to highlight the pan-Armenian nature of this movement, because during this process in Yerevan and outside of Yerevan, we have felt that the gravity of that movement.
Եվ սա այս փաստով ինքնի բացահայտվում է տեղի ունեցողի էությունը եւ ինձ համար սա առաջին հերթին հայկական պետական Հայաստանի պետական իմաստն ու նշանակությունը ճշգրտելու հաց է
And for me personally, this is a process of identifying the true meaning of Armenian statehood, of Armenian, the nation and the national problems.
Եվ գիտեք շատ երկար ժամանակ ինձ եւ կարծում եմ ելի շատերին մի հարց է հետաքրքրում մի հարց է տանջում ի վերջո ինչի համար է Հայաստանի Հանրապետությունը եւ ինչու պետք է Հայաստանի Հանրապետությունը գոյություն ունենա
For a very long time, I have been struggling to define that question, why or what is the purpose of an Armenian state, of its existence as such.
Եվ այս հարցի պատասխանը ես գտա Հայաստանի Հանրապետության որը փոփոխությունների ժամանակների ընդհանրապես չի
And I found the answer to my question in the preamble of the Armenian constitution, which during the past 3 changes of the constitution has stayed intact and has not changed.
Ինչն է այստեղ ամենահետաքրքիրը, որ որպես հայկական պետության Հայաստանի Հանրապետության հիմնադիր հանդես է գալիս հայ սահմանադրության
And what is the intriguing part in this? That the creator, the founder of the Armenian Republic serves as the Armenian people. People as a whole serve as the founder of the Republic.
Ես ուզում եմ հատուկ ուշադրություն դարձնել ոչ թե Հայաստանի Հանրապետության քաղաքացիները, ոչ թե սովետական Հայաստանի քաղաքացիները, այլ հայ ժողովուրդը տվյալ դեպքում հանդես է գալիս որպես Հայաստանի Հանրապետության
I want to pay a very particular attention to the fact that it's not just the citizens of the Republic of Armenia, not the citizens of the former Soviet Republic of Armenia, but the Armenian nation as a whole serves as the founder of the Republic of Armenia.
Եվ հայկական պետության Հայաստանի Հանրապետության գոյության իմաստը ինձ համար հենց այս անկյունակարային փաստն
And the true meaning of the existence of an Armenian Republic, of an Armenian stand, is this cornerstone.
Եվ ես համարում եմ, որ Հայաստանի Հանրապետության գոյության իմաստը հետևյալն է. հայության տնտեսական, ֆինանսական, գիտական ներուժը կամ նրա զգալի իր տարածքում կենտրոնացնելը եւ այդ ներուժի անվտանգությունը եւ բնականոն զարգացումը
And the particular meaning is that the Armenian state has to serve as the grounds where the social, financial, brain power and all of the major powers of the Armenian nation could be utilized and safeguarded.
կամ նրա զգալի մաս
Or the very significant part of it.
Եվ ահա այս փոփոխությունների ռազմավարական հեռանկարը եւ նպատակը հենց սա է դարձել Հայաստանի Հանրապետությունը այսպիսի պետություն եւ մեր խնդիրն է որ մեր ժողովրդի արտագաղթի հազարամյա անիվը կանգնեցնել եւ յետ պատտել Հայաստանը դարձնել մի պետություն որը ծառայում է հայության ներուժի պահպանմանը եւ նրա բնականության
And the strategic outcome of this question for us is the main challenge for us is to turn back the millennia-long immigration problem of our nation, to turn back this wheel to get people back to meet and solve these challenges.
Եվ սրա համար մենք մի կարևոր նախապայման ենք տեսնում Հայաստանի Հանրապետությունը քաղաքացին պետք է իրոք լինի բարձրագույն իշխանություն եւ մենք կարողացանք Հայաստանի Հանրապետության քաղաքացուն իրապես օժտել բարձրագույն իշխանություն
And to achieve this goal, we saw one serious prerequisite, that the Armenian citizen had to be the absolute power in the Armenian state. And we were able to achieve that goal in order to kickstart the solution of all of our other problems.
Եվ թերևս սա պետք է համարենք Հայաստանի քաղաքայի մասին անկյունաքարային
And we should consider this as the cornerstone for Armenia's tomorrow and future prospects.
Հայաստանի քաղաքացին պետք է թե ով լինի
In the Armenia, citizens of Armenia have to decide who is going to be their ruling government.
Եվ ով դադարի
And who should stop being their ruling government.
Սա է մեր այս ընթացիկ քաղաքական process-ի ամենակարևոր նպատակը եւ առանձնահատկությունը
This is the most important point in our current political discourse.
Որը սակայն ամբողջական ծրագիր չէ Հայաստանի ապագայի մասին
Which is in itself not a project in its entirety for Armenia's future.
բայց նաև մոդելի եւ բովանդակության կարևոր մեթոդ է
But is a very strategically important method to achieve that goal.
որովհետեւ երբ որ կա քննարկում եւ կա ընտրություն եւ մարդիկ հնարավորություն ունեն որոշելու երբ որ կա բանավեճի հարթակ եւ օրինական ժողովրդական հասարակություն եւ ինքնիշխան պետություն նրա բովանդակության ապահովումը դառնում է քննարկումների բանավեճերի եւ տեսակետների
Because when there is a discussion and choice and debate and a just society, the realization of such problems and challenges becomes seizable.
Can I interrupt and ask you some questions about those?
Այո, ես ուզում եմ եւս մեկ անգամ ողջունել բոլորին։ Եվ ասել, որ ձեր աջակցությունը վճռական նշանակություն է ունեցել մեր այս քաղաքական process-ի հաղթանակի համար։
I want to congratulate you all and mention that your support has played a vital role in the success of our struggle.
Mr. Prime Minister, you know better than anyone that in Armenia and also in the diaspora, the expectations are out the window. And what everyone, citizens and non-citizens, are going to look for is an understanding of your priorities and the way in which you intend to move forward. Can you help us understand that?
Իհարկե։ Ես արդեն հենց առաջնահերթության մասին եմ խոսում, որովհետև մենք համոզված ենք Հայաստանի ըմ, սխալ ճանապարհանալու գործընթացը սկսել է այն պահից, երբ սկսվել է հիմնադրվել է ընտրությունների կեղծման համակարգ։
I already spoke of our priorities because we were convinced that the present challenges and problems facing Armenia emanate from the fact that elections were systematically rigged over the period of past 30 years.
Մեզ համար ամենաառաջնահերթությունը անշրջելիորեն ազատ արդար ժողովրդավարական ընտրությունների ինստիտուտ
The priority for us is the establishment of just and honorable and transparent elections and electoral institutions in the Republic of Armenia,
որպեսզի որևէ ընտրությունների արդյունքներ կասկածի տակ չբերվեն որևէ մեկի։
so that nobody has any intention or in any way could challenge the legitimacy of our future elections.
Եվ հենց էսա ճանապարհը, որպեսզի մեր կարծիքով քաղաքացիները իրենց կան երկրի տեր, իրավունքի տեր, ազատության տեր եւ օրենքի տեր։
And this is the way how the citizens of the Republic of Armenia are going to feel themselves as the owners of their country and the group that is going to set their future path.
Ինքնիշխան քաղաքացին, ինքնիշխան պետության երաշխավորն է։ Ինքնիշխան քաղաքացին օրինականության եւ օրենքի իշխանության երաշխավորն է։ Սա է մեր առ։
A sovereign citizen is a guarantor of sovereignty, and a sovereign citizen is who sets the just and honorable path for its people.
So,
Եվ օրենքի իշխանության
And the just government.
and just rule. So, in your answer, you are assuming a continuing, sustained awareness and ownership by all of the nation, Armenians in Armenia and Armenians in the diaspora, that citizenship, ownership idea continue, not just when they're in the street, but also to hold your government and the next governments accountable. Is that...
Այո, իհարկե, տեսեք, եթե մենք խոսում ենք ազատությունների մասին, ի վերջո ընտրությունները ոչ միայն իշխանություն ձևավորում են, այլև իշխանություն հեռացնում եւ հենց քաղաքական ցանցության ինստիտուտի երաշխիքը ազատ արդար երբ մարդիկ կարող են ոչ միայն ազատ արդար ընտրություններով ինչ որ քաղաքական ուժի բերել իշխանության, այնպես էլ ազատ արդար ընտրություններով այդ ուժին հեռացնել իշխանություն։
Of course, when we are speaking of free elections means that those can either bring a certain political power to power, but also can remove a certain political force from power. So through that, what we mean is through transparent electoral institutions, people can elect a certain political force into power and then as easily be able to remove.
Ինչ եմ ես այս հարցին ես կարևորություն տալիս, որովհետև մեր ճգնաժամը սկսել եւ խորացել է ընտրությունների արդյունքները կեղծելու արատավոր պրակտիկայի ներդրումից։ Եվ անկեղծ ասած, սա համարում է մեր կառավարության ամենակարևոր առաջնահերթությունը դառնալ ժողովրդի ինստիտուցիոնալ իշխանության երաշխավորը։
And why do I give such prominent importance to this question? Because I strongly believe that all root of our problem is the falsification of our elections. And I see the organization of transparent electoral institutions as the guarantor of people's institutional power.
So how do we go from election to election? In between elections, how do we sustain a citizen's engagement and involvement in Armenia and through the diaspora? How do we continue to engage?
Գիտեք, ես կարծում եմ, որ այս փոփոխությունից հետո քաղաքացիների ներգրավված հողելու խնդիրը մենք չունենք, որովհետև սա իսկական քաղաքացիական եւ ազգային զարթոնք եւ այդ զարթոնքի իրական էությունը հետեւյալն է յուրաքանչյուր քաղաքացի պայքարի է իր իրավունքի եւ ապահովության համար քաղաքացին իր է եւ սա ամեն աշխիքն է որ նրանք կլինեն ներգրավված ինչ վերաբերվում ներգրավվածությանը այստեղ մենք ի խնդիրներ ունենք օրինակ Հայաստան սահման վայ կներեք
Շնորհակալություն, Գերամ.
You know, after these changes, people's participation will no longer be an issue because this is a national popular awakening, and awoke citizens will be involved in the changes that will guarantee their future.
Սփյուռքի պարագայում մենք խնդիր
We don't see such a problem in the involvement of the diaspora either.
որովհետև մեր սահմանադրությամբ նախատեսված է, որ օրինակ նախարար կարող է նշանակվել այն մարդը, ով վերջին 5 տարում, վերջին 4 տարում հանդիսացել է միայն Հայաստանի քաղաքացի եւ մշտապես վերջին մշտապես բնակվել է Հայաստանի Հանրապետությունում։
Our constitution states that cabinet ministers could be appointed people who in the past 4 or 5 years have been exclusively citizens of Armenia and have resided in Armenia.
Մենք կարծում ենք, որ այս կարգավորումը չի արտահայտում մեր ազգային ձգտումները եւ կարծում ենք, որ այս սահմանափակումը ստեղծում է արհեստական խորհուրդներ Սփյուռքի ներգրավության
We think that this distinction does not reflect our national condition, and then this restriction restricts certain parts of our diasporan society to have direct participation in Armenian affairs.
Մենք մտադիր ենք այս արգելքները վերացնել, որպեսզի Սփյուռքի ներուժը հնարավորություն ունենանք օգտագործել պետական կառավարման եւ պետական ներկայացման գործում։
We are determined to alleviate these restrictions so that we can harness the full potential of diasporan involvement in Armenia.
Thank you very much. That's a great point to end on. I know the audience is going to blame me for ending this conversation here, but I have to do that. So, Mr. Prime Minister, thank you again on behalf of all of us watching and all of us ready.
Հույս ունեմ առաջիկայում կհանդիպենք ձեզ հետ Թուրքիայի շրջանների հետ առավել մանրամասն քննարկելու մեր անելիքները, որովհետև իսկապես սա համազգային զարթոնքի պահ է եւ այդ պահը պետք է մեզ բոլորիս բերի օրինակ։ Շնորհակալություն եմ ձեզ եւ ձեզ արդյունավետ
Thank you.
Thank you all. This is a moment of national pan-Armenian awakening, and it shall not be missed. And I hope to meet all of you in your communities soon in person to discuss these challenges and find outcomes.
And because the diaspora is not as democratic as Armenia yet, on behalf of all of us, I give myself the right to invite you formally if and when you wish. Thank you again. That worked out well. We can come off the pins and needles now. We are going to begin with the first segment of our program, and just to tell you how lucky the Institute is with the support it gets from throughout the university, we have two professors who are going to moderate the first half and the second half of this program. The first half's moderator is Professor Rob English, who just got married yesterday. And he's here anyway. And joining him are 5 individuals, all of whose biographies are in your booklets. I'm not going to take the time to read them all, although they deserve far more. I simply want to say that between Maria Garabedian, who's going to be on Skype, an activist involved in the month that was April, whom you saw on the platform several times, as well as the 4 guests who are going to be here. Katie Pierce, who studied social media even before it changed the course of Armenian history. Anna Ohanyan, who is a political scientist from Massachusetts, who studies state formation, democratic processes, and 2 individuals who are going to talk to us about the world. Fayez Hamad, who is a professor of political science here at USC, specifically about the Middle East and politics of the Middle East. And you remember there was a spring there a few years ago. And Mr. David Usupashvili, who was head of Georgia's parliament just a few years ago. And when I got him online on email about 3 o'clock in the morning and asked him to commit, he said yes, right away, back and forth. And by 4, I said, doesn't anybody in the Caucasus sleep? Because as you know, nobody in Armenia sleeps at 2 or 3 in the morning. He said, the Caucasus has been asleep long enough. So I welcome Professor Rob English and our wonderful guests.
Thank you. My job is just to set the stage for our expert participants, and I just have 2 things to do before I turn the floor over to them. One is something optimistic and happy, one is something pessimistic. The first is once again simply to salute SALPI and the Armenian Institute. You see how special they are and how remarkable the events they organize have always been. I have chaired or participated in literally dozens, maybe hundreds of post-Soviet, Russian, Eastern Europe transition-oriented events. And you never see this combination of energy, insight, but especially the juxtaposition of analysts and activists, right, of policy makers with policy analysts. People who discuss and analyze and actually do it. And that's what Salpi and her crew organize all the time. In fact, they themselves are both analysts and activists. That was the positive. The negative, in setting the stage for our conversation now, is to remind how difficult the path is ahead. It was only a few years ago, the ecstasy, the anticipation, the soaring joy of the events in Ukraine. I mean the Euromaidan revolution of 2014. And very quickly, that transition became mired in corruption, cynicism, and a revanche of the oligarchic old guard that, having stoked the forces of right-wing nationalism, is in some ways even worse than what went before. At least that's what many Ukrainians feel, who rank their current government and their current prospects even lower than those of the regime they so recently overthrew. That was the Euromaidan, but just a decade before that was the Orange Revolution, which similarly became mired in its own corruption and crippling infighting among erstwhile allies in democratization. And other so-called color revolutions in the former Soviet Union have been followed by similar disappointments, from the Caucasus to Central Asia, and even further abroad, from the countries convulsed by the so-called Arab Spring to what we only recently believed were the most successful and consolidated democratic transition countries in Central Europe. Now democracy seems to be on the retreat everywhere. As I said, the revanche of oligarchic business interests, the dangers of inflaming nationalism or ethnic hatred, splits between the urban and rural citizenry of these countries, a whole range of factors have complicated these transitions. So with this gloomy but necessary introductory caution, the questions I want to pose to our panelists are, what can we learn from these previous democratic revolutions, these transitions, including how they went awry? What were their main domestic and foreign policy mistakes? And how can Armenia's democratic revolution avoid the same fate and succeed where others have failed? To begin, I'm going to turn to Anna Ohanyan, Professor Ohanyan, and ask to focus in on the nature of Armenia's democratic revolution. Constitutional, extra-constitutional, peaceful or violent. What do we know? What have we learned from what's underway right now? And optimism or pessimism?
Thank you. Before I start, I should simply state how humbling it has been to observe what has transpired in Armenia. And so I'll use the word unique. I think that word is definitely justified. The social movement in Armenia that developed the democratic transition, whatever we call it, mass-scale civil disobedience, it was unique because it was unfolding in an overall highly authoritarian regional neighborhood. The bright side, however, is that now there is a democratic dyad in South Caucasus with Armenia and Georgia, hopefully will be mutually reinforcing. Globally, just to echo to what Professor English just mentioned, authoritarianism is definitely increasing. Number of transitions to authoritarianism are much higher, but then democratic transitions. And this is where Armenian social movement is so unique because it offers a very specific pathway for many countries that are stuck in between democracy and authoritarianism, hybrid regimes, a way out. I'm very optimistic as to where this is headed. Studies show that the type of the democratic transition determines the democratic durability, whether a particular transition will succeed and will consolidate is very much dependent on its roots. How did it develop? Transitions that are more big bang, that are top-down, elite-driven, come in big waves, they usually do not have a good track record of consolidating democratic outcomes. In the case of Armenia, this was strategically peaceful, it was grassroots, and it was highly institutional. These are the three features of this transition that I think will have created a wonderful, solid foundation for Armenia to consolidate its democracy. And in this respect, I would like us to, and again, echoing Professor English, get us out of the post-Soviet geopolitical context. The movement in Armenia is unique, but I think in terms of its democratic transition component, it is very, very comparable to democratic transitions in some Latin American countries in 1970s and 80s, or in Spain, which is considered the gold standard of how to consolidate democracy. Because the movement was so decentralized and so grassroots, it essentially produces a very solid civic engagement, which is needed in order to prevent authoritarian resurgence. This is something that the Prime Minister also mentioned. Put in simple words, awakening, civic awakening. That's a political resource that is going to come in handy. And in terms of the institutional dimension, and I will stop on this note, not only this current transition, this current social movement, but also prior episodes of peaceful protests in Armenia struggling with the hybrid regime, institutional levers were used even though they were fraudulent, even though the electoral regime was compromised. Again, looking at situations in Latin America as well as in Spain, those democratic transitions succeeded, the ones that worked within this flawed constitutional order, and that essentially allowed to keep the movement peaceful, but also to reach out to groups that might have been benefiting from the previous authoritarian regime, but now need to be brought into the broader fold.
Thank you. I'm going to turn next to David Usopashvili and remind the audience that in 2003, after more than a decade of stagnant post-Soviet authoritarian rule, the Rose Revolution brought to power the people, swept aside after a stolen election, the old guard, and the government of President Mikhail Saakashvili came to power. What lessons from the Georgian experience, what to do, what to avoid, would you highlight for Armenia today?
Thank you very much, everybody, for allowing me to be here today with you and share these emotions and expectations all of us have about future, about tomorrow of Armenia. And these recent events demonstrated once again that Armenians are very wise people, because they skipped these first waves of democratic revolutions in the region, color revolutions. They skipped the second wave of revolutions, Arab Spring. Why? In order to observe, to analyze what went right, what went wrong, and to make successful revolution. And I wish that that's the case. And in coming future, we will see that, yes, Armenians are rich with their own experience and knowledge, and also they shared everything what was going on in the region. And yes, Georgians and I myself were more than ready to contribute to this very important thing. Why? Because I love Armenia more than Georgia? No, I love Georgia more than Armenia. But I know that prosperous Georgia, democratic Georgia, stable Georgia is impossible without stable, democratic, prosperous Armenia.
Yeah,
that's why it's our joint effort. Therefore, I'm more than ready to share mistakes as well. Yes, in 2003, something happened very important in Georgia, and that was very successful during the first years. Why it was very successful? Why modernization was so fast? Why petty corruption was defeated in the country? Why corruption became matter of shame, not matter of pride as it was before? Because we had political leaders who had the vision, and we had political team who had the vision. We had the team which had experience. Since 1995, the team who led to the revolution were considered as reformist wing of Shevardnadze's government. And they already introduced many reforms in judiciary, in making more transparent public money spending and so on and so on. So that was a very important thing. We had not just the understanding what we did not want anymore, but we knew what we want exactly, because this blueprint was created. In 2000, we created very complex anti-corruption program, which Shevardnadze did not do, but Saakashvili did. That's why it succeeded. Therefore, it is very important to see very soon that Armenia is led by a team which has common vision and common program which they want to implement in the country. Second, very important ingredient of the success was the international support. All strategic partners of Georgia saluted that revolution and supported its outcome, and we are ready to go as far as Georgians would be able in terms of democratization, modernization, and so on. This is a very key issue for Armenia now, whether all these strategic partners will be equally motivated and supportive to the change which is started in Armenia. And probably there are some things to consider, how to navigate in this situation, how to make sure that Armenia becomes modern, democratic, westernized state, and it keeps its strategic partnership with the countries it has to keep, but those countries are not making obstacles, at least some of them. This is a very important thing. Now, the Rose Revolution finally ended with some not very good achievements. In 2012, in fact, there was kind of the reaction on the revolution, because the last years were not as good. Why? And I would make 3 important points, and I would ask and urge Armenian leadership not to repeat that. First, unfortunately, the revolution for many meant fight of good people against bad people, and not fight of good policies against bad policies. This must not be repeated. Second, the new government came to the power without exit strategy. And this is very important. It could be sounding very crazy. The people have not entered yet to the power system, and I'm talking about exit strategy. But it is important to have exit strategy. What means is that every single country needs not one set of good people who are capable to govern the country, but other sets of the people who can come and do this job, meaning the peaceful change of the government through the elections must be possible. And this must be demonstrated by the new government, by the new leaders. They should avoid the same mistake when everything good and everything necessary is associated to the one man or one team. Such good Bolshevism, because Bolshevism is Bolshevism, it cannot be good. And that's why the government must demonstrate that they came for doing good things, but they are not the sole actors in Armenia, and they are supporting the other institutions which need to come there. And there's third point, very important one. The Prime Minister mentioned this, that citizens are the owners of the country and they must become the owners of the country. Yeah, that's very important, because Georgia and Armenia and some other countries also, we jumped from the concept of communist comrades to voters of democracy. We skipped the very important concept of citizen. And governments do not treat the people as citizens. Government treat people as voters who will vote during the elections and ensure the continuation of the power. Yes, that's a very key component of it, to make out of each single Armenian person a citizen of Armenia. And that's a huge job of the new leadership. Thank you.
Professor Hamad, whatever strikes you of primary importance from the experience of the so-called Arab Spring for Armenia today?
Well, thank you, Rob, and I'm glad and delighted to be here. Well, unfortunately, the Arab Spring turned into a very deep, cold, and long winter. So I'm here to deliver the not so rosy news in the hope that the Armenian case will avoid the pitfall that the Arab Springs have experienced. Let me preface by saying that the forces and actors that led to the protest in Armenia that caused the toppling of the government are not necessarily the same forces and dynamics that will determine the path moving forward or the end result of that protest. Another way, one way to see it, if what is the events in Armenia for the last 2 to 3 weeks are the introductory chapter of a story, the story of Armenia, the subsequent chapters and the conclusion most likely will be written, if at least not co-written by other actors and players. And with that in mind, I just want to outline and identify 3 factors that came of importance in the Arab Spring, in the hope, again, the Armenian case is able to avoid them. The first one is the role of the military and the security apparatuses. In the Arab Spring, the military refused orders to shoot in the Tunisian case, compelling the president to flee the country and usher a transition. In Libya, the military split, and it took the intervention of NATO to decide the outcome of the former regime, and perhaps you know the history of that story. In the case of Armenia, it is most fortunate for Armenians and everybody who cares about human rights and political developments in a democratic fashion, more fortunate that the outgoing prime minister did not give orders to the military to shoot. And perhaps if the Armenian story is to fold in the way we want it to end, at least from our perspective, this, I think, will have a far more consequential impact moving forward than what is currently appreciated. But if you consider the military role in a country like Egypt, where the military refused orders to shoot, thus determining the fate of the former President Mubarak, and the military, as a result of that move, was seen as the champion and on the side of the people. But it was the same military that a year later decided to implement its own agenda that was not seen by many Egyptians initially, and did not have a problem at all to shoot 1,000 Egyptians dead on one day in broad daylight, to assume power and to topple and to overthrow the first elected, democratically elected government in Egypt. So I just want to keep that in mind, particularly given the Karabakh issue in Armenia, where it introduces a level of militarization that impacts the society and the polity of Armenia. And as such, one needs to be mindful of that and not to lose sight of it. The other issue I wanted to bring from the cases of the Arab Spring is the role of sectarianism and schisms. The old regimes, otherwise, they've entrenched themselves for so long, and the Armenian case is not different, for 30 years since the first attempt. And these entrenched interests do not go, unfortunately, peacefully. They have interest, and they want to protect them, and they always have the ability to perhaps reassemble themselves. So with that, one needs to be careful of the potential creation of fault lines, and I don't know exactly in the Armenian case what could that be, but it could be as simple as beginning to create the schisms among Armenians of the need for stability or order, as opposed to instability and chaos and so forth. So that's a very important thing to keep in mind. The third and last dynamic I wanted to bring to your attention is the role of the external factors, the intervention of these regional actors. In the Arab case, that superseded the domestic factors. In other words, the balance of power regionally superseded the balance of power domestically. When you talk about a revolution from the grounds up, usually one would hope it to remain as to the net balance of the domestic configurations, debates and arguments, in the shape of the society, the economy, conservative versus liberal, and so on and so forth. Yet in the Arab cases, with almost no exception, that was all superseded by the outside considerations of the neighboring countries, whether it's Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, all began gradually but surely to insert their own interest, thus affecting and hijacking the domestic balance of power inside the country. Of course, here one is correct to focus almost exclusively, at least initially, on that domestic configuration in the case of Armenia, but one cannot rule out and cannot have the luxury to rule out the potential interferences of neighboring countries inside or beyond that. For example, if you talk about Russia, one could safely say Russia had little impact on this bottom-up revolution or movement or what one want to call it. But Russia might decide, if not others, to insert itself to co-write the unfolding story of the Armenian book. And with that, I urge everybody, including this audience who is a participant and a player for the unfolding Armenian story, to be vigilant and to maintain the focus on the end result, the desired result, which is the creation of a responsible polity, accountable government that is first and foremost for the Armenian peoples wherever they are. Thank you.
I'm going to turn next to Maria Karapetyan, who's joining us, I guess by Skype or some technology that's beyond me to describe, from Yerevan. And I'm going to ask you, I guess, a simple question. How does all this sound, these lessons, these priorities and pitfalls from Armenia right at this moment?
Good evening, everybody, and well, good afternoon, everybody, and good evening to everybody who's watching us in Armenia right now. Well, actually, I think everything that's being discussed, that's being said, is very, very relevant for also the discussions that are taking place within Armenia today. I think that whatever internally the Armenian society today is concentrating on is the expectations, the long-term expectations coming out of this process. And here probably the primary importance falls really onto putting Armenia onto the path of democracy. As the Prime Minister has mentioned, truly preparing for the next elections and making sure that they do take place in a transparent and just manner is of utmost importance to the society right now. But also, beyond this, there has been this lack of a sense of justice in society that needs to be restituted. And here, probably the spectrum is much bigger. Something needs to be done about the monopolies in the economy. Something needs to be done, a lot needs to be done about corruption at different levels, from the state level, and descending all the way to bribery, trick elections. And generally, a lot of things need to be put in place in order to avoid the repetition of the same situation in Armenia in the same future. Also, the logistical changes that have taken place in Armenia in the recent years are all questionable. They take place in order to consolidate more and more power in the Republican Party's hands, and in particular in leaders. Even small changes, all the way to the Constitution, are now being questioned. So, another important step that the government needs to take is to have open public dialogue regarding all the changes that have taken place in Armenia. How many of them are wanted? How many of them can be reversed? Or should we actually close taking into consideration whatever that has already been done, a new page?
Thank you. And let me thank also our participants for being so concise. It's going to give us some time for back and forth, which is wonderful. And our last initial statement from Dr. Pierce, and with your expertise in particular on political communications, communication technology, social media, what have we seen that's different in a qualitative and quantitative way, and what does that bode for the future, again, in Armenia and throughout the Caucasus and other transition states?
Sure, yeah, thank you so much. I want to speak a little bit about some of the interesting things that happened with technology and social media during the protest events, but also looking forward in terms of how this might extend the use of technology and social media in the governing, as it's already existed and it will continue to exist in this transition time. So first I want to mention that it's very important for all of us that we do not give too much agency to technology. When people say things like the Facebook revolution or the Twitter, or the revolution will be tweeted, it makes me a little uncomfortable because the fact is that political actions are taken by people, and they are the important actors in them, and that technology is merely helping to facilitate, amplify, extend things that people can already do. So I'd like you, as I'm speaking, imagine the same events that have been going on in Armenia for the last month and a half as if it was 20 years ago. I don't even want to say 10 years ago. In 2008, there certainly was a lot of technology being used in the events of that time. But even 20 years ago, what kind of differences existed? So the first point I want to make is that the organizers of civil disobedience and the protest were excellent at using social media for giving people instructions. So for example, tomorrow we're going to meet in this location at 1700. Tomorrow we want you to do this and that. They were very clear instructions given via social media. And not only would that happen every evening at the rallies, but it could happen throughout the day if plans had changed. And so that sort of ability to convey information very quickly, if we were imagining this, in our minds, this equivalent event 20 years ago, that just would not have been possible in the same way. And the organizers knew that and were very good at using this. In particular, I do want to draw attention to the fact that Nicole himself is masterful at his social media presentation. In particular, as we saw earlier, his one-on-one video communication. He has been doing this for years. I don't want to somehow equate him to these kind of people, but he is as good as the best makeup vlogger, the best social media influencers. He is really good at it. And in particular, similar to FDR in the US with his fireside chats, he does a really good job at engaging in what we as communication scholars call parasocial relationships. Even in the reaction to him on the screen, I feel this, you may feel this too, this sort of personal relationship with this man that I doubt that many of us in this room, any of us in the live stream, or indeed Armenian citizens felt that kind of personal relationship with a politician before. And I think that this was key in his success. He's very charming, obviously, and he's very good at this. He looks you in the face, he smiles a lot, it really feels personal. And that's been very important. I also want to draw attention to the fact that probably those of you in this room that haven't slept very well in a month know that the constant flow of information from Armenia, video live feeds, but also news reports coming at people that are not physically in Armenia and people that are in Armenia, was an incredibly important way for information to be shared and also for people to let their preferences be known. One of the difficulties in life, if we hold an opinion, we don't actually really know if other people share that opinion because people might not talk about it. But with social media, we get an immediate sense, people changing their profile pictures, posting about things. We get a sense of how people are feeling. And so this was really important. So that all happened during the protest events, but now we're entering the phase that there's actually governing to do. And as you might be aware, Nicole continues to do regular Facebook Live feeds, although thankfully he's not doing them as often. Probably better for him to actually do some work. So he continues to report every day what he's doing and what he's planning to do. This is really interesting and a very different way of governing. And my hope is that this will help people continue to be engaged with what's going on and hopefully bring about some transparency. However, I'm not entirely certain that this is going to be sustainable for him or for citizens or for any of us. Although I really do want to know what is going on with that jackal, it's going to be difficult for all of us to continue to watch these feeds about what's going on in his life. And I'm not really sure how that's going to intersect with other ways of governing. I also fear that by doing much of this on Facebook as a platform, this is a proprietary platform, it's not a traditional media platform, that in a moment, that could all be cut off if someone wanted to. That relying on that particular source could lead to problems in the future. And then finally, I think that I'm really glad that social media has allowed everyone in this room, I imagine, a different way of engaging with the events in Armenia. But this too is a question of sustainability. Everybody needs to sleep a little more. Our feeds are full of this information constantly. Where is this going to go for us in the future is really important to think about, and getting back to sort of normalcy while also keeping engaged in that particular way.
Thank you. Let me pose one or two provocative questions to anyone who feels up to the challenge. And the first is to ask about different constituencies in support of revolution, in support of major political change. Revolutions are usually made in the capital, in major urban centers. But revolutions often fail in the hinterland or in the provinces, where often a majority of people live who have different needs, maybe a different socioeconomic situation, a different orientation to politics, European models, human rights, whatever it might be. And we've seen, maybe partially in the Georgian case, certainly in the Ukrainian case, that the euphoria of revolution was more the euphoria of, in perhaps the most admirable section of society, educated, liberal, desirous of Western European kind of change, but they failed in good time to satisfy the demands, the needs of the bulk of the population, which had often more basic bread and butter concerns, for whom, example, a new foreign investment regime brought no gain in the near term, or for whom certain priorities of, let's say, law enforcement reform or urban renewal meant nothing. So my question is, those lessons, if you want to comment on them, and is Armenia at any risk for losing sight for the benefit of one part and the most active and admirable part of the population, if I can venture such a loaded phrase, to lose sight of the demands of another part of the population, and what needs to be done to make sure that doesn't happen? Anna, sure.
I can take that. That's really an excellent question. In terms of specific to Armenia, as I mentioned, the type of this particular transition that will determine its success, because it was so peaceful as a movement, it was able to bring in many, many people from very diverse backgrounds. The movement cut across urban and rural divides, and that was very significant. Women were at the forefront. Youth was definitely in leadership position. So in terms of the representation, this was definitely diverse. But in terms of as to whether they will be satisfied, I'm a little bit worried that the expectations are sky high right now, and a little bit of echoing Kate a little bit here, with the streaming and the constant contact that is coming from Nikol Pashinyan, it's wonderful, but at the same time, it creates an expectation that a single individual will be able to solve these problems. There are a vast variety of problems, and there are huge conversations that need to be happening as to whether market reforms need to be continuing, and if so, in what shape, and it's these types of policies that will affect rural-urban divide. But overall, again, looking at Latin American transitions, South European transitions, poverty in general is a very significant risk factor for democratic consolidations. So I do not expect that one individual will be able to do that, to address all of these issues. What I would hope would happen is that the parliamentary system, the party politics will become stronger. I think the parliament came out as a much stronger institution out of this transition. I think the split screens of people in the squares watching the parliamentary sessions, that was a respect for the institutions, no matter how flawed, and that really reflected the maturity of the Armenian population. So those are some of the issues to take. But essentially, I guess, when I would feel comfortable that Armenia has consolidated its democratic opening is when people make a connection between the pothole and the parliament, that they really have to work through the parliament to solve some of the very basic problems.
And
any other quick additions to that? I want to involve everyone.
I might add to that, too, that one of the greatest strengths of this movement is its early engagement with regions outside of the capital city. That was one of the smartest things they could have done. And I absolutely agree with Anna that the community of people engaged with the protests was very, very diverse. However, it is a challenge to know, and one of the problems also with those of us that get our information via social media is that we are missing out on those who are not. Sometimes it feels like a lot of Armenians are on Facebook, and it's true, but we're missing out on people, and it's not randomly distributed. Elderly, poor, rural, disenfranchised, and how did those people feel? Nicole's yet so far been very smart about his communication strategy being very plain-spoken, very clear, very direct. If I was making decisions, though, I would try as hard as I can to be, after moving past the free and fair election issue, to get on issues that are going to touch the widest variety of people. I think it was very wise of him to say to parents of soldiers, stop sending your sons Goods, the government, the army should be delivering these goods. That's something that touches everyone. Healthcare, education. If they can early on address things that are going to reach a broader spectrum of the society, that would be very wise for being inclusive and remaining the support of those kind of people.
David,
Well,
yes, add to that.
Yeah. The question is actually about the most fundamental problem our countries face there. And it is, just imagine traveling from Tbilisi center to Yerevan center and crossing these towns and villages. What is the picture? You start from here, go down, 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 down until you reach the border. You continue down, 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 and then go up. Of course, higher than Tbilisi, but meaning the country is not the same country. The people live in so different circumstances and conditions that the common future is, the understanding of the common future is very low. Because when you travel through the more or less developed country, you see same America, same Germany, there are differences. But what are the differences in our countries? That's why we need to understand how differently those people are understanding all the things, how differently they are digesting what has happened, what are their expectations and so on. And that's where we are coming to that key point. How to make from this population the entity of the citizens who have the common future. Because what unites these people is common homeland, common history, but not the common future. And this common future is called modern state. And we failed so far in our region, our countries, to build modern state in our homelands, which would take care of these kind of issues, inequality, equal distribution of resources, responsibilities, and so on. For that, the new government probably needs to introduce very urgent measures. And those measures sometimes are not popular. And sometimes people think, what's the relevance, for example, changing the system of administration of the income taxes to the issues what people now expect. But there's, in fact, huge relevance. Just ask average Armenian citizen how much he or she earns. The answer would be the amount which comes to the pocket. The other money which was taken as income taxes is not considered as my money, which I earned and gave to the government. That money is considered as government's money, and if something comes to me, just a small portion, I'm already so grateful. So this must be changed. If the administration of income taxes would allow person first get the whole income and then pay this 20 or 26 or whatever % to the government, then that person would be attached to the government. Then no Serge Sargsyan or David Usupashvili or Nikol Pashinyan or whoever could be able to last so long without addressing the needs of those people, without explaining why this is happening or why that's not is happening. This is a very urgent thing because creation of modern state in our countries became a huge problem. We thought that our great history of statehood would be kind of positive side in our attempts to build the new modern state. It appears that it's not positive side so far. We live in our history, we bring some great stories from those great past, and we fail to do very simple things which are necessary now. So that would make the citizens involved, engaged, and becoming owners of their country.
Fayez, your follow-up as well.
Briefly, the experiences in the Arab cases bring one dimension I think that needs to be kept in mind. It's the initial phase, which is not as which had enjoyed the same level of excitement and if not euphoria, that there was a great deal of underestimation and exaggeration. And as such, one way to avoid such sentiment is to begin delinking the democratic development and that it is going to produce some economic miracle all overnight. That extremely will disappoint lots of people big time. I think the challenge is to, sure, the government needs to deliver And if it does not, there should be a mechanism in place for it to be thrown out of the office in a democratic fashion. And as such, the idea is through the process to get on board as many actors as possible where all agree that democracy is the only game in town. And that actually will be a huge success without paying attention, or rather without linking the two together so as to disappoint people and then become disengaging people going back to the old regime type of days.
Thank you. We have exactly 1 minute left, so any following comment has to be very short. What is the biggest foreign threat to Armenia's transition? People have been amazed at how smoothly things have gone with Russia. What about Azerbaijan? In what ways could the Karabakh conflict derail what's underway? Any thought to that, just in a nutshell?
Well, with one sentence, there's no threat from Georgia. That's what I can assure.
With that, unfortunately, I have to call a close to this first session. Join me once more. Thank our panelists. Wonderful, thank you.
I think we need to get out.
That's one of the best short answers.
Thank you, and thank you. I think they've been amazing, and having David Usupashvili here, I think adds a whole level to the conversation that we need to be aware of. So this is the rest of our program. We will conclude with an interview with a quick Q&A with President Armen Sarkisyan. He will conclude our program. Prior to hearing the president, Professor Dan Mazmanian and our 4 experts will be up, and I'll introduce them in a minute. What we want to show you now are 3 videos. The first, and all very brief. The first one is a timeline for April. The second and third are very quick talks with 2 very important economists. Daron Acemoglu, who is at MIT, whose book Why Nations Fail stresses the importance of institutions for both economic and political development, and Bedros Terzian, who heads an operation, a large one called Petrostrategie. He's an oil and gas and energy consultant, and both of them are talking about Armenia's economy, prospects, needs, urgencies. Daron addresses questions of kleptocracies that must transform. Bedros talks about how do you achieve political, economic independence if you're Armenia in the region in which you're at. So please take a look at the videos, and we will follow with Professor Dan Mazmanian and 4 of our guests. Thank you. Professor Acemoglu, thank you very much for giving us the time.
Thanks you. It's a great pleasure to be here.
And I'm very sorry you're not here, but hopefully next time.
I hope so.
Tell me, please, the one fundamental question that I think we're all wondering about is, if what we've had thus far has been more or less a kleptocracy, where it was okay to do with the resources of the country as the ruling elite wished, wisely or unwisely, how do we get from that point to an even playing field?
I think that's the great question of the day, and it's not just for Armenia, for many countries. I think there is very little doubt that, broadly speaking, Armenia has been under a kleptocracy for the last 2 decades or even more, and it's wonderful that there is a turning point or a potential turning point. But unfortunately, there is no blueprint for any country to follow closely and make sure that they get out of kleptocracy. The way I would like to think about it is that such a change has 2 legs. And the first leg is that you need a peaceful political transition, meaning that you actually require that there is the beginning of a process of political change, and that this doesn't spin out of control and turn into a huge civil war or a mortal combat between different factions. And Armenia miraculously perhaps managed that. We are in the midst of a process of political change. At least temporarily, the old guard are out. New faces, new blood, new perspectives are here. And more importantly, there is a broad enthusiasm in society, civil society, government, business, diaspora, all that we need change, and this is the right time for it. So this is just an amazingly fortuitous set of conditions for us to get going. But the second leg of this process is no easier, and that's how do you actually make sure that you start changing the fundamental features of a kleptocratic extractive system and create one in which there is a level playing field, there are incentives, there are opportunities, and people are encouraged to participate productively in the economic and social environment of the country. We know that it requires us to get rid of the corrupt elite. It requires us to bring new institutional elements so that the new system doesn't turn into one in which other individuals, other groups become the beneficiaries of corruption. How do you stop that? Well, the way to stop that, of course, having people who refuse to be corrupt is one element of this, but it's much more than that. You really require the institutional foundations of it, both politically and economically. You need a much better judiciary. You need to improve the way that you regulate the economy. You tax the economy. You create incentives for businesses. Very, very importantly for Armenia, you need to keep on building human capital. I think those principles include, first of all, exploit the good beginning that we've had, which means that instead of trying to sort of find ways of punishing your opponents or even punishing the people who were corrupt previously, just look into the future. The point is not to get revenge against opponents or anything like that, but to found the institutional backbone so that the same things don't happen again. And this applies not just to the political realm, it applies to the judiciary, to the bureaucracy. One of the reasons why, how could Armenia be so kleptocratic for so long? Well, one answer. Judiciary did not work. A country with an independent judiciary, judges and prosecutors who are honest and dedicated to their work and are not influenced and manipulated by politicians would not have stood by. So that means that judiciary needs fundamental reform. But that doesn't mean that you have to fire everybody. You have to change the rules of the game. You have to encourage retirements, perhaps, so that the worst offenders who are political appointees and who are not up to the job are retire with their pensions or whatever, but new blood comes in. That can't happen very quickly, and that's the real dilemma here, because you cannot fire 5,000 judges and prosecutors and bring new ones because the human capital is not there. So you have to do this slowly. You have to start cultivating the human capital, but the enthusiasm is there, both abroad and at home. But that's just one of the dimensions. The other ones all have their own character, but what's common among them is that you have to, again, grab this opportunity and build the institutional foundations. You know, we have an inspiring prime minister, but the worst thing that Armenia can do is, you know, create no institutionalized structure for the leader, for the executive, whoever that is, to govern. So the way to deal with change is not to say we have to do the change, whatever the cost. We have the way to tackle this change is to create the institutional foundations, create political organizations, parties, civil society organizations that are going to get involved in politics. That's great because Armenian society is mobilized. Armenian society is excited. Armenian youth is excited. Those are just the right times to start creating these institutions.
Thank you. The news is that you will be also on the record, off the record, advising the Armenian government. Is that true?
Well, I would be very happy to do whatever I can because this is a historic opportunity for Armenia. It's really something that we've all wanted to see, and I cannot imagine a better beginning as the first chapter of a new era. But what I just answered in response to your question also says that what I can do is only advisory and limited because there is no blueprint. If this was like building a dam or a bridge, you know, I could draw the blueprints and say, this is how you should do it. This is how you stress test the dam. You should use steel, not this. And that's it. That's the blueprint. Unfortunately, social change doesn't work that way. Unless you understand the real details of the conflicts within society, the personalities, the fault lines of where the institutions, regulation, corruption, vote buying, patronage, exploitation, media manipulation, all of these, how they work. Unless you understand them, and an outsider like me, you know, whatever you do, you're just not going to be able to understand them very well. Unless you understand them, you cannot come up with the right compromises and the right strategies and tactics for dealing with the process of institutional change. I am happy to share what I know because this is an exciting time. This is the least I can do. But I think at the end of the day, you know, who has to step up? The Armenian people, not the prime minister, not the MPs, not the bureaucrats, not the judges, certainly not me, and not the diaspora. It's the Armenian people, the youth, the people who have been silent and sidelined for so long. They are becoming involved in politics. They have to find a way of remaining engaged and turning this into a positive process of change. And I don't mean by that people should be, protesting every day, but they should be engaged. They should refuse the compromises and the mistakes that were made for the last 2.5, 3 decades, and continue to provide their support to whoever is undertaking meaningful reform and keep their vigilance so that a new corrupt kleptocratic group doesn't come in place. They should form through media, through non-governmental organizations, civil society, the right way of monitoring the process so that it's not the old guard, it's not incompetence, but positive change that's ongoing.
Thank you. Thank you for your time and your thoughts, and I am sure we will be hearing from you again and frequently, and that's a good thing.
Thank you, Safi.
Thank you. Mr. Terzian, thank you for joining us. I'm going to ask you one of the questions that is possibly the fundamental question when we're talking about future political and economic development, and that is the issue of energy, because it has both security implications as well as economic implications, obviously. You're the expert in the field. What is it the Armenian government needs to be thinking about as it thinks about future development?
Energy is the central pillar of an economy. At the same time, it's an important element of political independence. Now, if we take the case of Armenia, which is a landlocked country with hostile neighbors, with Azerbaijan and Turkey, we must design and imagine an energy system which must be at the same time independent, local, clean, and as cheap and low cost as possible. The present system is mostly based on nuclear power. We have an old plant, and the government plans to use it up to 2027, which is really a maximum limit. Now, as far as I know, there are no alternatives, and we are late because we don't have enough time. The other part of the system is based on hydropower and natural gas-powered plants. Now, what needs to be done is to make most of solar and wind potential in Armenia. We have a lot of wind potential and solar potential. Of these two, we can make the needed energy for the nuclear power plant. We don't need any more than nuclear power plant if we develop the solar and the wind energy at their maximum levels. At the same time, we can double production of hydroelectricity and use water more efficiently. There is a lot of waste in Armenia. Why? Because in Soviet era, when there was a problem, the solution was always supply side solution, not efficiency side solutions. So if you have a water needs, you add new supply. You don't think about how can I use my water resources in a better way. Now this must change. We have a lot of water resources, and we can make a lot in power production and for irrigation.
You know,
And we need finally some natural gas powered plants because of balancing. So we still need natural gas, but the main source of energy must be and can be solar energy, wind, and hydro.
you know, what you're saying mirrors what environmental activists in Armenia have been saying over the last 5, 6, 8 years. And I repeated what you just said to a friend the other day. And he said, is it possible that Armenia, in fact, has enough that it can, in fact, rely just on those two sources, hydro and solar? Is that a realistic goal?
Yes, it is realistic. In addition to natural gas, as I said, because of balancing needs, natural gas will be used as a swing producer for electricity. But the main sources can be and must be hydropower and solar and wind. We have a lot of potential in solar and wind. Now, the other advantage of investing in solar and wind is that this is very flexible investment. It can be very small investments, starting with only $1,000 for an individual house, going up to 100 million, 150 million, whatever it is, for large solar plants producing electricity. So it gives also flexibility, and it gives independence. This is an independent, clean energy source.
Is this being done anywhere in Armenia?
Not yet on a large scale. The law on renewable energies was only voted 2 years ago. We are very late, at least 10, 15 years late on that. But it can be done. If we put a lot of efforts on that, it can be done. I think that if we really put everything needed in that field, we can avoid having to build a new nuclear power plant. Nuclear is a past energy, and in addition, it's a very costly. Now, if we want to build a nuclear power plant, we need $6 to $7 billion investment, even in a small size or middle sized plant. This means we will almost double the external debt of Armenia. The Armenia economy cannot support that.
Great. Thank you very much. When you plan a program in 2 weeks, you work with the schedule of the experts you have. And Both of them were very willing to do this, but were unable to do it by Skype, so we're grateful to both Daron Acemoglu and Bedros Terzian for being with us. I'm going to introduce Professor Dan Mazmanian and the next panel, Edward Muradian, Grigor Atanesian, and Emil Sanamian. When I said we're very grateful to be in a university with a lot of really good friends across campus, Dan Mazmanian is one of them. He's a member of our academic council. He used to be dean of the policy school, so you can't get better than getting the former dean of the policy school to talk about policy and what happens next, what comes to us now, what do we do. Participating with him are Edward Muradian, someone very familiar with Armenia's judicial system, Grigor Atanesian, who's at the University of Missouri. He's originally from Russia and studying a Fulbright scholar in the journalism school, and Emil Sanamian, who knows as much about the region and military and strategic initiatives and history as he does about Armenia's internal politics. We're very grateful to have them all. Following this panel will be the message from President Sarkisyan. Thank you.
So in this panel, we have the pleasure of looking ahead. It is time in the program where we ask ourselves these broad questions about moving forward. And they're really two momentous issues, it seems to me, that are central to Armenia's what's being called Second Velvet Revolution. And they'll be the focus of our discussion in just a moment. First, the first question is, will it endure? What changes are required in the economic, the political, the civic, the cultural life of Armenia? Second, what role can and should the Armenians living abroad be playing in this transition? We have a panel, as indicated, of 4 well-informed and insightful speakers who've been introduced. So let's begin. Edward, share your thinking on the importance of the rule of law and the judiciary in a democratic society and a thriving economy.
Thank you, Dan. This is a interesting and global question. Rule of law the role of rule of law in developing democratic society. I can speak about this for hours, and at the same time, the answer is simple. It is impossible to go ahead and have sustainable development without rule of law, because after all, as the Prime Minister just mentioned, we are in a quest for just Armenia, for just government. And as you know, governments usually are not just, especially the executive that has a very specific agenda and oftenly considers that all means are good in achieving this agenda, objectively. They're not to be blamed because they have to deliver specific actions, specific reforms, specific results. And all means are good. Whatever you do, just achieve there, just deliver, just show your constituency that you delivered. And there needs to be a system of checks and balances, which we all know very well about, and everybody in Armenia knows very well about that. But it is having that system work and actually balance off the executive, put restraints on the executive, but restraints that would not frustrate any policy, but vice versa, enable the policy. I've recently listened to a lot of interviews and opinions and on how to proceed with the reforms and how to make this process, this exciting, really exciting process of changes that all of a sudden came after this stagnant environment dominated in Armenia for over a decade. And all of a sudden this fresh air comes in and people stand up against ineffective government, should we call it, injustice, should we call it. And changes are imminent. they come around, in the words of the Prime Minister, members of his cabinet announcing, I turn on my Facebook and I see the Prime Minister saying, you know, influencing the courts is not something I'm going to do. It's a red line for me. I'm not going to cross it. And the message was that the courts are in a deadlock. They have to pass important political decisions, and they seem to be unable to determine what they should decide because they've been influenced constantly by the executive, who decided what the outcome of at least the most important cases should be. And now these impulses, the signals, these instructions are not being channeled to the judiciary properly, and judges may be lost. That's a very possible situation. At least that's what the Prime Minister reported in his live stream. And the message to the courts was, no, we're not going to give you more instructions. We are immediately transitioning to a situation of rule of law, of independent courts. Well, is that enough for the courts to become independent? Is it enough for the leadership of the country to convey the message that from this point on, courts are independent, we're not going to influence your decisions, go ahead and decide whatever you feel like? Is that enough? Let me bring up a simple matter to be a little bit more specific, because everything I say was going to be very general. There is a notion of responsibility of a judge for the decision that he makes. And this responsibility, the legal, the statutory expression of this responsibility has been discussed at length. And many politicians felt that the judges should be responsible for the decisions they make. Isn't that right? Wouldn't you agree? I mean, we give the judges so much power to decide whatever they want. We give them only one standard, base it on the law and your sincere belief. Okay. Should the judges be responsible for the decisions they make? Should they? No. Anybody thinks judges should be responsible for the decisions they make? Of course yes, or of course no? Who is yes? Who is yes?
The right answer is yes.
And who is no? Well, see, my conclusion, I don't know if I'm wrong, please correct me, Dan, but my conclusion is that most of the active audience thinks the judges should be responsible for the decisions they make. Well, guess what? You just eliminated independence of the court. Because you just said that the judge shall make a decision, but there will be someone who is able to call the judge to account for that decision. And we're not speaking of the superior court that will not hold the judge accountable. He will just correct the mistake the judge committed. Okay? So the same matter was discussed in Armenia and was decided that yes, judges should be responsible for their decision. With that responsibility, we have Ministry of Justice, Judicial Council, now the Supreme Judicial Council, enabled to call a judge to a responsibility for the decision he entered in due process if he breached the law in his decision. And if you ask any U.S. lawyer or any U.S. judge whether the judge should be responsible for a decision, it goes with big red letters. The judge is not responsible for the decision he makes. No one can hold the judge responsible for the judicial act that he makes, because that's what the principle of independence of the court is based. The judge, the most important obligation of the judge is to secure due process, parties' abilities to submit their case, argue it, and then he enters the decision. But once you make him accountable for the decision to any other official, Where is independence? I mean, this can go for hours.
I
realize we've been working on the judicial reform in Armenia for 15 years in different stages. I was lucky to participate in one of the stage, an exciting experience for me as a newly appointed judge, and this reform resulted in major changes in the judiciary. And I hope this process now, with healthier political environment, which I hope will be established after the new elections at the parliament, I hope this will really bring us to having stronger and more independent judiciary, and allow the dream of having just Armenia.
So
For sake of fairness, I should say that everything that has done till now, or most of what has been done till now, was in general, most of it were positive developments. They did not render the results for one simple reason. There was no political will of having independent courts. Yesterday, after seeing the Prime Minister's live stream, I put aside my speech that I prepared for today, and I'm here to tell you there is a political will in Armenia to have independent courts, because the only official that is elected by the people, the leader elected by the people, tells us we want independent courts. What can be more important? Now, what we got to make sure is this becomes a sustainable will.
Which goes actually to the purpose of raising this issue, as well as the others, which is what issues are so critical to the sustaining democratic society that people are wishing for. And I know we could spend the rest of the afternoon on just this one, but we're going to move on. So, Grigor, how important is public accountability? And in this context, free media as a backbone to a real democratic society?
Well, thank you, Dan. One of the most important consequences of this Armenian revolution is the heightened interest of both Armenians in Armenia and the Armenian diaspora, Armenian communities all over the world, to politics. And I was preoccupied with this question: what as a journalist, I and we as journalists can do to sort of sustain this interest, to address this new demand, adequately address it, and keep those in power accountable. And I was thinking of this line, which comes from the ethics code of the Society of the Professional Journalists. And it goes like, for our journalism and for our democracy to reach full potential, it's crucial to have a robust supply of reliable information about key issues, and it must be made accessible for all. And I was thinking, now what does that mean? It basically means that we all have to know a lot of stuff about what is going on all levels of our governance. And how do we do that? How, as a journalist, I can do that? Well, you know, there are tools which we rarely discuss, but they do exist in Armenia. For example, Armenia has a freedom of information law, which was adopted some 15 years ago. And it was never fully implemented, but it's a great law which actually requires public officials to disclose, especially when requested by journalists, a whole bunch of information about who they hire, how do they spend money, and so on and so forth. It's a bit of outdated law because it was adopted 15 years ago. It perhaps can be amended, but even the enforcement of this law would change drastically the whole picture and, I guess, political life of the country. And we as journalists, we should be pushing for and using those instruments that we already have. And it will take, frankly, for the journalism and for the democracy to function, to establish and develop institutional transparency. And of course, it should be the journalists who must be pushing for it. The new government, as of now, appears to be very sympathetic to the idea of transparency. And during the whole transition period, you perhaps all noticed how Nikol Pashinyan was insisting on meetings and negotiations only in front of cameras, only in the presence of of the media. And now he does this Facebook Live videos, even chasing a coyote. I mean, it's something, they are more open than the previous government has ever been. But it should be the media community which is pushing for the institutional framework for this transparency. Because, it's good to know what is going on in the residence of Prime Minister, but it's also good to know who he meets every day, right? To have his calendar, to have his meeting schedule, to get access to his correspondence. As, for example, you have in the US, you can request the correspondence of any public official, and if it's not classified, you will be granted access to it under the Freedom of Information Law, FOIA, the American one, which was, of course, the model for the Armenian legislation. And, for example, you all perhaps heard the story about the EPA chief, Scott Pruitt, who flew only business class and had this crazy amounts of money spent on security personnel, and he was justifying it by saying that he's receiving death threats. And then media, using this Freedom of Information Law request, they actually requested from the EPA any letters that he received with death threats, and EPA officially reported that he received none. And it was only his desire to fly first class that made him do that. So I want to see this kind of stuff in Armenia. I want to know what's going on with our, to say, environment protection ministry. There is a lot of very concerning projects going on, mines. Many activists are very concerned about impact on the ecology and the environment of Armenia. So we need to have instruments like that in place. But also, that's all good. We have demand stuff from government. But as journalists, we also have to think what we are doing wrong and what we perhaps can reevaluate in terms of our practices, standards, and ethics. And there is a couple of issues which I feel like it's high time to deal with. And first of all, perhaps it's the tendency to sort of personify and tendency of sensationalism in the media. When we cover news events as, X versus Y, as a story of stuff being said by the most famous or infamous people in our country, as opposed to systemic problems, which for example, we can be talking about whatever stuff Gagik Tsarukyan or Samuel Alexanian says, and we can be discussing that all day, every day, and putting it in our headlines, or we can talk why we don't still have a professional legislature, why we have those oligarch MPs, what laws should be implemented, should be adopted, should be written to finally draw a red line between special interests and public service and stuff like that. So, but also, what is perhaps even more crucial right now, there is also one, and no doubt that's a global trend, but we can also see it in Armenian newsrooms, tendency to focus on negative events. And I think it's particularly dangerous right now because we have this, and everybody mentioned it, we have this unexpected, tremendous citizens' participation in Armenian politics, and Armenian newsrooms have to behave in the way that won't endanger it. Because if we keep focusing on negative events, not community building, not citizen participation, but just whatever bad stuff which is going on, we are risking sort of making people go back to this old narrative of politics as a field which is owned by rogue actors, and if you're an honest person, you have nothing to do with politics. It's too depressing. It's always too dark, and you better stay in your own private life, develop your own private interest, and never enter this public space. So these are my main concerns for now.
Grigor, you have now given us a second huge challenge, but once again looking forward, which is this whole issue of accountability and the role of the media. These are generic problems or generic issues, as well as the courts, that all societies face, but Armenia is facing them very directly right now. And I want to turn to a third area in Irina, who's joining us by Skype. what are a few of the critical changes needed in Armenia's state institutions to better serve the people in this, I will call it post-Soviet Armenia?
Professor Mazmania, thank you so much. Well, first of all, let's be clear that institutions do not deliberately fail. Institutions are managed and run by people. So it is the political leadership that was in charge of the state institutions in Armenia that has failed its citizens. There are very few state institutions in Armenia that we could confidently say are established bodies, have institutional memory, can sustain political power changes, and can function as real institutions with internal checks and balances, as opposed to stiff vertical power structures, something that we actually had seen for many years in Armenia, especially in areas such as justice or the court system. So in addition to that, because state institutions in Armenia have had such weak institutional structures, the real role of the political leadership in charge of these institutions was ever more prominent. So I want to address the elephant in the room, and that the political leadership in charge of Armenia and the country's state institutions was the Republican Party of Armenia, who has been in power for now more than 10 years since their victory in the election of 2007. Now, naturally, for any political party, one of the key objectives is attaining political power. However, for the Republican Party, holding on to power became an end in itself. From one election to another, the election fraud became more sophisticated. If 10 years ago the RPA would stuff ballot boxes under a gunpoint, in the most recent elections, widespread vote buying was what brought them the majority in parliament. Election fraud had systematically alienated the citizens of Armenia. Their vote did not count, it was not important as a political agency. We were reduced to nothing. So the civil society continued to be weak and people continued to vote with their feet, leaving Armenia. Under Republican parties and Sir Sargsyan's leadership, Armenia lost close to 370,000 people to exodus. As election was built, so were other institutions in Armenia. Given the time constraint, I emphasize two areas in particular, also echoing what Serdar Acemoglu said earlier. First is the justice system. The judiciary in Armenia under leadership became a tool of political power preservation and perpetuation. From political prisoners to non-prosecution of election fraud, from non-prosecution of the murders of March 1st, 2008, to the punitive use of detention, it is important to note that much of those people who left Armenia over the past decade were not only those with better jobs and financial stability or financial success, but more importantly, those who sought social justice and institutional justice. Another sector that is absolutely mentioning is governance. I would like to specifically outline the fiscal governance. From municipal budget and road construction to the provisory supply of basic needs for the conscripts in the Armenian military, those in charge ones would operate on kickbacks under the table dealing. Professor Mazmanian, and the second part of the question was about what changes are needed in going forward. Let me start here as well. One of the first things I believe that this new government needs to implement are forensic audits of, without exception, all state institutions and government-funded projects and endowments in the country. This is absolutely necessary to, first of all, assess the damage of poor governance, hold those accountable, and reevaluate state spending. This is also, and more importantly, an effective exercise in establishing a much-needed trust between the state institutions and the taxpayers. We haven't had a chance to talk about the economy, but by various accounts, the shadow economy is about $4 billion. So this new government will have the chance to bring a substantial part of it into the formal economy. I know I'm running out of time here, so let me just conclude here by adding that one of the most important changes that are needed and that this new government has already started is transparency and accountability of governance, and equally important is inclusiveness. The previous government created this huge gap between the people and the state. There were two parallel realities, with the state and its media delivering news in Soviet-style propaganda reporting that all is A-OK and the government is doing a stellar job. And the other reality was and is continued demographic crisis, poverty, unemployment, economic stagnation, and ever-growing and looming external state budget. Now, the Velvet Revolution was the most effective exercise in bridging that gap, making people more inclusive and participatory in the political processes. May 1st alone was historic because every Armenian was glued to his or her mobile device for close to 10 hours listening to the political Q&A on the floor in the parliament. That's more than an average American's viewing time of C-SPAN in his or her entire life. And let me end here on this positive note. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So Emil, you've been listening all day and have been watching this very closely yourself, and I want to just ask you, in the context of kind of wrapping up this conversation, is based on all the things we've been hearing, what are some analogies or some of the lessons learned elsewhere in the region about these very same issues?
Thank you. Well, I'm going to try to be a little entertaining, considering I'm the last here, and this is still sort of the tail end of the celebrations that we saw on April 23rd, that we saw on May 8th. What were we exactly celebrating, whether that people in Armenia or us here, sort of with our gaze towards Armenia, permanent attention towards Armenia, sort of this big fan group of Armenia that we are in the United States and elsewhere. I think one fundamental thing that we were celebrating is that finally, after 30 years, Armenian citizens were able to coalesce, create a critical mass, and exercise their power to get a leader of the country to resign and to hand power to an opposition candidate. This has not happened in Armenia's history prior to this, in independent Armenian history, ever before. And this is something that was not created over a 2-week period. It was not created over this march that Nikol Pashinyan did from Gyumri to Yerevan. It was created through this very little and some of the bigger streams of erosion of this monopoly on power that was occurring in Armenia over the past decades, right? I think this institution is part of that effort to erode that monopoly on power through supporting critical research, supporting independent media like Salpi was involved with CivilNet. All of that work had finally borne this fruit. Now that fruit's been born, what do we really have now today with this new Armenia we didn't have before? Well, I think number one issue that we are enjoying here is this new sense of buy-in into the government and into the country that people did not have before. The excuses that used to be used, this government cannot be changed, the elections are always fixed, I cannot express my opinion about this or that, I cannot run my business because of tax inspections, etc. Those excuses right now are beginning to fade. Of course, that does not translate immediately into success, as we already heard about Georgia, we heard about Ukraine. We've had experiences where there's been this moments of victory, popular victory, that did not translate into long-term successful outcomes. I think what the slow progress is the progress that sticks. I think what my personal expectation would be for this slow and steady progress to bring Armenia to a qualitatively new place towards the time when Nikol Pashinyan has that exit moment, when he is thrown out of the government, not hopefully through popular uprising, but through the election. Because that moment has to happen in the future for Armenia to have a successful system where you have a change of government and where you have checks and balances. If we look at this last 10 years of Armenia's history under Serge Sargsyan, we can complain about different negative phenomena that was occurring in Armenia and we're all aware of, but one thing that was also occurring in Armenia is that Armenian media has become freer, much freer than anywhere in that part of the world with the exception of Georgia. We've had much more tolerance towards protests that we did not have. All of those things came together to make this moment possible. And hopefully this new government will be able to add to this progress that has been made to make Armenia much more of a successful enterprise for all of its citizens. Looking at what is happening around the world, in Armenia still and around the world, there is a concern that Armenia is essentially surrounded, if we look at what happened in Armenia as the revolution, by counter-revolutionary powers. Governments that have, over the past decade and decades, have moved away from the more participatory systems to less participatory and more restricted systems. Look at Turkey, where there's virtually no free media left, where the president's concentrating power. Look at Iran, where there have been efforts to modernize the country and to engage with the world, but on the one hand you have the conservative people, the Rahbar, the supreme leader who still controls, has an indefinite rule, and you have the United States renewing pressure on the reformist side of Iran. And of course look at Azerbaijan and look at Russia, where you have basically presidents for life at this point. There is a concern that these countries, at least especially Russia and Azerbaijan, might not be too excited about Armenia's success as a democracy, or Armenia's success as a more forward-moving country. We have to be mindful of that. We have to find, Armenian government has to find ways to address these concerns, and hopefully they will find a way, as I've seen over the past couple of weeks with the first meetings, international meetings that Mr. Pashinyan had. One more point I wanted to say about the success of Armenia so far is the success of Armenian institutions, which Mr. Pashinyan also acknowledged. Most importantly, the military. The fact that the military stayed neutral in all this process was a very, very significant event for Armenia. The fact that we have a foreign ministry, even though many people, I was a big critic of the foreign minister, but we had a foreign ministry with a lot of dedicated diplomats and a lot of experienced staff. So now that Nikol Pashinyan was elected prime minister, all it took for him is to take the plane and go to Sochi and be briefed on what is it that we have on Armenian-Russian agenda right now, or Armenian Kyrgyzstan agenda, or Tajikistan agenda, that we can discuss with this with these countries. And he's not starting from the blank slate. And even the less sort of the glorified or the less publicized aspects of the Armenian institutions, the institutions that continue to work throughout this protest period.
Thank you very much. Of course, I knew when we came out that we were not going to have time to digest and discuss all of these issues. I was hoping we could get on to even more, but as I looked up, our time is out. So I think on this note, which is actually quite positive about how Armenia is not like the countries that surround it in the region, and we do have hope in both changing our law, engaging our media, reform our institutions, and being aware of our special place, I think we need to thank the panel very much. Thank you all.
Thank you.
And finally, His Excellency, Mr. Armen Sarkisyan, the President of Armenia.
What are the biggest opportunities that this new change in government offers? Well, first of all, thank you very much for this opportunity, and I would like to address the audience, which is the University of South California, and I hope not only, all universities in California, United States, and worldwide. So basically, I would like to address the younger generation, the next generation of Armenians worldwide. The opportunities that this movement, the Velvet Revolution, which was the name that was used here in Armenia, I would call revolution Armenian style, which could be a trademark worldwide, the way that in the 21st century you can change the regime or political system through peaceful demonstrations and expression of your position and your beliefs. I think it's unique, it's wonderful, and it's also very important. And I think we as Armenians could be proud of what we have achieved during the April-May of 2018. And of course, that creates huge expectations worldwide amongst Armenians, especially among the younger generation, because that, first of all, makes Armenians, especially the younger ones, to feel again that they are the owners of this country, they are the owners of the values, they are the owners of the heritage, they are the owners of the future of this country. And the second time, it's very important that that feeling of being a citizen, i.e., being the responsible for the future, is there. When I was offered to become president, I was thinking that I will have 7 years of, through evolution and discussions, expression of your personal opinion or encouraging people to again become a citizen. Be free to express your opinion and stand by to your opinion, what you believe on, and also be a good citizen when you go to the election poll. Be honest and responsible. But instead of 7 years, it happened in 7 days. The opportunities are huge because we have, first of all, to use the fact that I call that we are a small state but a global nation. There are 4 or 5 times probably more Armenians living abroad than in Armenia today. A lot of them are very good citizens of the countries that they are living today. Some of them are highly recognized by international community as professionals, successful businessmen, scientists, politicians, and etc. And most of them are highly respectful, honest people. So it's the time that everybody recognizes that Armenia, their homeland, is really their homeland, and they belong to this state and they belong to this great nation. And to use this opportunity of rebuilding our country, our state, for the next generation, to make sure that tomorrow Armenia will be better than today and the day after tomorrow will be better than tomorrow. So that's the huge opportunities that are ahead. I believe that this nation is mature and wise to use this historic opportunity. I'm very optimistic.
So do you see any pitfalls?
Well, the pitfalls are as usual in individual life as well. You can have wonderful opportunity, but if you miss it, then you missed it. I think this is a wonderful opportunity to channel the huge energy that has been created during this 1 month, the positive energy of expectation and hope and freedom, and responsibility to channel it into creative work, be that creation and the rebuilding or building and making stronger our state, the institutions of the state, be that ministries, departments, because that's the only way to run the country. So first of all, that's opportunity to make that stronger, better, much more efficient, and optimize it. The second thing is to really open the door for every Armenian that believes that he has something to offer to his homeland, to have this opportunity of investing time, energy, professionals, know-how into this country. But if we miss it, that will be, well, I will be very, very unhappy, because this is a great opportunity for generations ahead.
Mr. President, if you could have a magic wand, what are the 2 most urgent and fundamental things that should happen first?
For me personally or for the country? For me personally, if I would have my magic wand, I would like immediately to to see all the children, younger generation of this country living in a peaceful, successful, wonderful country. The country is wonderful. The country is magic country, and I would like to use this wand to make sure that the world recognizes not only that this country can create a unique way of changing political system, that this country can not only be proud of its heritage, that this country is a country that has survived the genocide, that this country sees as remembering the genocide, as we showed on the 24th of April, that we are a nation that we can put aside all of our differences and eventually come together despite our differences, political or even belonging to different parts of the society or being poor or rich, doesn't matter. We all are united when it matters, and the remembrance of genocide matters for the whole nation. So I'm very proud of that. So if I had a wand, I would like to make sure that every Armenian continues this belief in the fact that they are citizens of Armenia. So it doesn't disappear, because all our future successes will be connected with one fact. Do we really believe that the future of this country is in our hands? Do we know that there is a huge responsibility, not only on the Prime Minister, President, Speaker of the Parliament, MPs, ministers? No. The responsibility is on every and each Armenian, be that in Armenia, in Artsakh, or in diaspora.
Mr. President, what message do you want to leave to that big audience, the community?
Well, the message is that I'm here to serve the country and the state and the interests of the nation, and I'm going to be open and accessible, and I'll be taking initiative to try to meet each of you personally. If you visit Armenia, you're all welcome to come here. If I'm traveling anywhere in Europe or the United States or anywhere in the world, my doors will be open for you, because I do think that neither president or minister, prime minister, we cannot basically achieve what we want to achieve alone. You are sons and daughters of Armenia. You have to be sons and daughters, and no matter where you live, doesn't matter, do you carry American passport, Argentinian passport, French passport, or you have the Armenian as well, or you carry only Armenian passport. You have to believe that you are a part of this great nation. So, well, I hope one day, at the end of my term of president, at least I will be able to say that all of these years I achieved something, to be not the president of the citizens of Republic of Armenia, but also the president of all Armenians worldwide. Not by name, but by work and hard work to make this country great. Thank you.
We're grateful to the President for making the time. We sent the questions and he gave us his best, so thank you again. I also want to thank and apologize Irina Raplanian, Dr. Raplanian, for not introducing her when I introduced the last panel. Before I invite you out to join us in a simple reception and continue this conversation, I want to say something about 3 W's. The first W is women. The government of Armenia, that was easy. The government of Armenia and the diaspora have the same challenge. We need to not just be more inclusive about women, but also making paths open and available in order to benefit from the entire nation. And what we can do at the Institute, we are prepared to do, and we're also prepared to make those same processes available to the organizations, the institutions, and the government of Armenia, number 1. Number 2, Washington. We're taking this theme to Washington on Tuesday. The Institute of Armenian Studies, together with the Brookings Institution and Georgetown University, we're doing a typical Washington roundtable for policymakers, Congress, the media, about Armenia tomorrow. Just wanted you to know. That's Thank you. This is the time. This is the time to own this topic and make it a topic about Armenia and not about all of the other things that it usually becomes. So we're happy and proud to be able to do it. And the third W is welcome. We welcome your presence here. We welcome your continued interest and engagement in the Institute, and we would welcome you as donors and partners. This is an expensive process. The research that is going to be required to be of service to the institutions and the organizations in Armenia that require it and need it, and to the diaspora as it re-examines our role as individuals in the diaspora, as institutions in the diaspora, and as an adjunct, a part of, an annex to, a partner with Armenia. All of that is going to take work, both this kind of work, making the research, the scholarship accessible to the public, as well as supporting the research itself. So we look forward to welcoming you and having you join our Leadership Council and our group of wonderful donors. Thank you for being here. Please share the hashtag and the video, which will be online, and join us for coffee and tea outside.